Ballroom at the Harbor View Inn smelled like roses and money, neither of which belonged to me. I remember standing just inside the entrance, adjusting the collar of my good navy dress, the one I'd bought on clearance at Macy's 3 years ago, and saved for occasions that mattered. I thought this was one of those occasions, my son's rehearsal dinner. 200 guests, open bar, a five-piece band that I later found out cost more than my first car. I had written the check for all of it. I smoothed the front of my dress one more time and walked in. Nobody came to greet me. I want you to hold that image for a moment. Not the dress, not the ballroom, just a 63-year-old woman walking into a room full of people celebrating her son, and not one of them, not one, moving toward her. Because what happened that night didn't start in that ballroom. It started 31 years before in a hospital room in Columbus, Ohio, when a nurse handed me a 7-pound baby boy and I looked at his face and thought, everything I do from this point forward is for you. I never stopped believing that. That was my first mistake. My name is Irene. I am 63 years old. I worked for 28 years as a licensed practical nurse at Riverside Methodist Hospital, mostly night shifts, mostly the oncology floor, because night shift differential paid better and I needed every extra dollar I could get. My husband, a man I will call my ex-husband because that is what he became, left when my son was 4. He didn't leave dramatically, he just sort of faded. 1 month he was there. 2 months later his truck was gone. And his clothes were gone, and there was a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I'm sorry, I'm not ready for this." My son was 4 years old. He didn't understand the note. Neither did I, honestly. So it was just the two of us, my son and me, in a 2-bedroom rental on Broadview Road, with a landlord who raised the rent every January and a furnace that quit every February. I picked up extra shifts. I did home health on weekends. I clipped coupons from the Sunday paper and made a game of it with my son. Let's see how much we can save this week, because I didn't want him to feel the smallness of what we had. He was a bright kid. Curious, funny, the kind of child who asked questions that caught you off guard. Why do stars stay up? Why do some people have more than others? I answered as honestly as I could. We talked at dinner every night, even when dinner was boxed. Macaroni. Those dinners were my favorite part of the week. He grew, the way boys do, fast, and then suddenly you're looking at someone who isn't quite the child you raised, but isn't yet the man he'll become. He started high school. He joined the debate team. He got good grades without much pushing from me, and I was so proud of him that sometimes I'd stand in his doorway after he'd fallen asleep and just look at him, thinking, look what you became. He got into Ohio State on a partial academic scholarship. I covered the rest, tuition, room and board, books, by cashing out a portion of my 403(b) retirement account. My financial advisor at the time told me not to. Irene, he said, you will pay penalties, you will lose the compound growth, please don't do this. I thanked him for his advice and did it anyway. My son had worked hard. He deserved to go without the weight of loans dragging him under before his life even started. I never told my son where that money came from. He graduated in 4 years, got a job at a logistics company in Cincinnati. Good salary, benefits, the whole thing. I was so happy for him, I cried at his graduation. He hugged me in his cap and gown and said, "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom." I held those words like a stone in my pocket for years afterward. I turned them over in my hand when things got hard. I believed them. And then he met her. Her name was Brittany. She was 27. She worked in marketing. She wore her hair in a way that looked effortless, but I suspect cost a great deal of money. I want to be clear, I tried. I invited her to Thanksgiving that first year. I asked her questions. I listened to her answers. I did not make comparisons or criticisms. She was polite to me in the way that people are polite to furniture, acknowledging my presence without really seeing me. My son changed around her, slowly, the way water changes rock. You don't notice the erosion until one day you look and the shape is completely different. He stopped calling on Sundays. When I called him, the conversations got shorter. He started spending holidays with her family in Scottsdale. Her father owned a construction company. Her mother drove a Range Rover. They had a pool and a guest house and a life that I imagined looked to my son like everything he'd grown up without. I don't blame Brittany entirely. I want to say that clearly. Because what happened at that dinner, I've spent a long time thinking about whose failure it was, and I keep coming back to the same answer. It was my son's. A 31-year-old man makes his own choices. But I'm getting ahead of myself. About 2 years before the rehearsal dinner, I found a lump on the left side of my neck, just below the jaw, about the size of a grape. I told myself it was nothing. A swollen lymph node, stress, dehydration. I was a nurse. I knew better than to tell myself that, but I also knew what certain words meant, and I wasn't ready to hear them. I finally went to my doctor in March. She sent me to a specialist. The specialist ordered imaging. The imaging came back showing a mass in my parotid gland, the large salivary gland, just in front of the ear. It was a tumor. The good news, they said, was that it appeared to be a pleomorphic adenoma, which is benign in most cases. The bad news was the location, the size, and the fact that a small percentage of these tumors turn malignant, and the only way to know for certain was to remove it. The surgery was scheduled for May. It was a parotidectomy. They go in just in front of the ear, follow the facial nerve, and remove the tumor while trying not to damage the nerve that controls movement on half your face. The recovery takes weeks. There's a scar. There's swelling that takes months to fully resolve. I was told I might have some facial asymmetry afterward. I was told to rest, to avoid stress, to take it slow. I told my son in April. I called him on a Tuesday evening and explained everything: the diagnosis, the surgery date, the prognosis. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Okay, keep me posted." That was the whole conversation. 4 minutes. Keep me posted. He did not come to the surgery. I had a friend from work sit with me, Marlene, who had known me for 20 years and brought a crossword puzzle book and terrible hospital coffee and sat in that waiting room for 4 hours without complaining once. She was there when I woke up. She drove me home. She stayed 3 days to make sure I was eating. My son called on day 2. "How'd it go?" he asked. I told him it went well. The tumor was benign. The nerve was intact. I was tired, but okay. "Great," he said. "That's great, Mom." Another short call. I lay in my bed that night, the left side of my face swollen and tender, and I told myself what I've been telling myself for 2 years by then. He's busy. He's building his life. This is normal. You raised him to be independent. I told myself a lot of things. 6 months later, my son called to tell me he was proposing to Brittany. He sounded genuinely happy in a way I hadn't heard in years, and I was glad for that, truly. I said congratulations. I asked if I could meet them for dinner to celebrate. He said they were pretty busy with planning. I said, of course, no rush. 3 weeks later, he called again and asked if I would help with the wedding costs. I want to describe exactly how that request was framed because the framing matters. He didn't say, "Mom, I'm struggling. Could you contribute something?" He said, "Brittany's family is covering the venue and catering, but there are other costs. The rehearsal dinner, the flowers, the transportation, the photographer, the honeymoon. We're thinking those could be split." And then he said a number. $48,000. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call. The left side of my neck still had a faint scar from surgery. I had 6 more months of monitoring appointments scheduled. I was 61 years old and working 4 days a week because my doctor told me stress was not good for my recovery. I had savings. I had always been careful, but $48,000 was significant. It was real money. It was money that was supposed to carry me through retirement. I said yes, because he was my son, because I had said yes his whole life, and I didn't know how to stop. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, I still believed in the version of him who had hugged me at graduation and said, "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom." I wrote the check in 3 installments over 4 months. I did not ask to be involved in planning. I did not ask for credit. I asked only to be seated at the family table at the rehearsal dinner, which was being held at the Harborview Inn, a waterfront restaurant in Cincinnati, with white tablecloths and a private ballroom and a view of the river that honestly took my breath away when I walked in. The flowers were beautiful. Ivory roses, eucalyptus, candlelight everywhere. I thought, my money bought those flowers. My money paid for this light. Not bitterly, just as fact. My son was across the room when I arrived, standing with Brittany and her parents and several people I didn't recognize. I made my way toward him. He saw me coming and something shifted in his face. Not warmly, more like the expression someone makes when an interruption arrives at a bad moment. "Mom," he said, "you made it. Not I'm glad you're here. Not come meet everyone. You made it. Like I had beaten traffic. Like I was an afterthought who had against some expectation shown up." "Of course I made it," I said. Brittany's mother extended her hand before my son could say anything else. She was a tall, polished woman named Sandra with a grip like a real estate agent and the smile of someone accustomed to social situations. "You must be Theodore's mom," she said. "How wonderful! We've heard so much about you." I found out later that was not true. Theodore, that's my son's name. Teddy. I always called him. But standing there in that ballroom, hearing his name said in that careful, formal way, I felt the distance between us like a physical thing. The dinner began. I was seated not at the family table, but at a table near the back, with Brittany's aunt from Tucson and two of Theodore's college friends I had never met. I told myself it was a seating logistics issue. I told myself there were 200 guests, and these things happened. I ate my salad and made conversation and smiled until my face hurt. Then came the toasts. Theodore stood at the front of the room with a microphone and a glass of champagne and the easy confidence of a man who has never once doubted whether he belonged in a room. He thanked Brittany. He thanked her parents by name, Sandra and Robert, called them family, called Robert the father figure who taught him what it means to lead. He thanked his groomsmen. He thanked the event coordinator. He thanked the florist. He did not mention me. Not an oversight. Not a forgotten line. He went through that toast systematically, thanking person after person, and my name was simply not among them. I sat at my table near the back, and I kept my face very still. Marlene always said I had a nurse's face, the ability to absorb difficult information without showing it immediately. I was grateful for that training in that moment. Then someone at the family table, one of Brittany's cousins, a young woman with a lot of opinions, leaned across to Theodore and said something I couldn't quite hear. Theodore glanced toward my table, and then, into the microphone, still smiling, he said, "Oh, and I should mention, the woman in the navy dress in the back, that's Irene. She helps keep my place tidy. We're lucky she could make it tonight." Helps keep my place tidy. I had not cleaned my son's apartment. I had helped him move in, once, 3 years ago, and I had wiped down his kitchen counters while I was there because they were dirty. And that is what mothers do. But I had never been his cleaner. I was his mother. I was the woman who had worked night shifts for 20 years so he could go to Ohio State. I was the woman who had sat alone in a post-surgical recovery room and not asked him for a thing. 200 people turned to look at me. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip. I set it down carefully on the white tablecloth. I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, picked up my purse, pushed back my chair, and walked out of that ballroom. Not fast. Not dramatically. I walked out the way I would walk out of any room I had decided to leave, with purpose, and without looking back. I drove home on I-71 North with the radio off. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because people always expect the tears, the immediate collapse. There was nothing like that. There was something colder. A kind of clarity that comes, I think, when you've been told something you already knew and the knowing finally reaches all the way down. I had been disappearing from my son's life for years. That night, he just made it official. I got home. I made a cup of chamomile tea. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and I wrote down every financial contribution I had made to my son's life in the past 5 years. The college fund withdrawal, which I calculated with the penalties and lost growth, came to just over $60,000 in actual cost to my retirement. The $48,000 for the wedding, the $1,800 I had given him when he was between jobs for 2 months in 2022, the $1,200 for his security deposit when he moved into his apartment, the $800 for the car repair he'd called about last summer. The total was significant, more than I had fully admitted to myself before that moment. I did not arrive at anger right away. First, there was grief, the quiet kind. Grief for the version of my son I had believed in. Grief for all those Sunday dinners on Broadview Road. Grief for the boy who asked why stars stayed up. But then, sometime around 2 in the morning, something steadied in me. I was a woman who had spent 30 years helping people in the worst moments of their lives. I had held hands at 3 a.m. I had learned how to tell the difference between a situation that could be saved and one that required a different kind of response. I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling the thing that is hurting someone. I called my attorney the next morning. Nothing dramatic. I simply wanted to review my estate documents. My will, my beneficiary designations, my advance directive. I had last updated these documents when Theodore was in college. I made changes. I will not detail them here because they are private and because the specifics are not the point. The point is that I stopped organizing my future around a relationship that had made clear I was not part of it. I also called my financial advisor, a different one than before, a woman named Patricia who I trusted, and we reviewed my retirement projections. I had more than I sometimes let myself believe. Decades of night shift differentials and careful living had added up. I was not comfortable in the way that Brittany's family was comfortable. But I was stable. I would be all right. That helped more than I can explain. Knowing I had not given away my security. Knowing the ground would hold. Theodore called 4 days later, not to apologize, to ask why I had left early. I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. Then I said calmly, "I think you know why." He said he didn't mean it the way it sounded. He said he was nervous and it came out wrong. He said he had a lot on his mind. I said, "Theodore, I paid for your rehearsal dinner. I have paid for a great many things over a great many years, and I did all of that gladly because you are my son and I believed in you. But when you introduced me to 200 people as someone who cleans your apartment, I think we both understood something about where I stand in your life." He was quiet. "I'm not calling to fight," I said. "I'm calling to tell you that I love you. That will not change. But I am also going to start treating myself with the same care I have spent 63 years giving to other people. And that means I will not be available in the ways I have been available." He asked what that meant. I said, "It means I'm going to go live my life now. I'll be here if you need me, but I am done arranging myself around being convenient." I hung up. I put the phone face down on the counter. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the maple tree in the backyard that I had watched change color for 11 falls. I took a breath, and then I called Marlene and asked if she wanted to go to Hocking Hills that weekend, because I had been saying I would go back there for 15 years, and I just kept not going. "Yes," she said, without asking for any other context. That is what a real friend sounds like. We went that Saturday. The leaves were just beginning to turn. We hiked Old Man's Cave and we ate sandwiches on a flat rock above the gorge, and Marlene did not ask me to explain anything, and I did not try to. I just sat there in the October air and felt something I had not felt in a long time, like I was allowed to take up space. Over the following weeks, Theodore tried several more times to reach me. The calls were awkward. He didn't know how to apologize properly, and I wasn't going to coach him through it. His father, my ex-husband, called once, which surprised me, to say that Theodore had told him what happened and that he thought I should forgive and move on. I thanked him for calling and did not engage further with the advice. Then, about 6 weeks after the rehearsal dinner, Theodore came to my house. He came on a Sunday afternoon, which was significant. He hadn't come to my house on a Sunday in 3 years. He sat at my kitchen table in the same chair he'd sat in since he was old enough to sit at a table. He looked tired. He looked, honestly, younger than he had at the rehearsal dinner. Less polished, more like himself. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry. What I said that night was wrong, and it was cruel, and there was no version of it that wasn't." I listened. He said, "I've been thinking about it every day since you left. I told myself I was building this new life, and somewhere along the way I started, I don't know, performing it, I guess, for Brittany's family. And I made you small to do that. That was wrong. I said, yes, it was. He said, I don't know how to fix it. I said, I don't either. Not quickly. These things take time and they take consistency, not just one conversation. I looked at him across the kitchen table. I am your mother. I will always be your mother. But I need you to understand that my love for you does not mean I will accept being invisible. I spent too many years making myself small so other people could feel big. I'm not going to do that anymore. He nodded. He didn't argue or make excuses. That was something. We didn't resolve everything that afternoon. I want to be honest about that too, because I think when people tell stories like this, there's a pressure to end with full reconciliation, with everything wrapped and healed. That's not where we are. Theodore and I are in the slow, careful work of rebuilding something that got damaged over years and didn't break in a single night. He came for Thanksgiving. He came alone. Brittany went to Scottsdale with her family, which is fine. It was just Theodore and me and Marlene and her daughter at my dining room table, eating turkey and green bean casserole and the dinner rolls that I always make from scratch because some things are worth the effort. We talked. Actual talking. Not the 4-minute calls. Not the keeping posted. Real conversation, like we used to have. After dinner, when Marlene and her daughter had gone home and it was just the two of us with leftover pie and the television on low, Theodore looked at me and said, I forgot how good it is here. I didn't say anything. I just let him have that. There is something I want to say directly to anyone watching who is in the place I was in, giving and giving until there is very little left, and then giving more because you don't know how to stop. I am not a therapist. I don't have a system or a set of steps. But I know this, the moment I decided that my life was worth protecting too, something shifted. Not just in how I treated myself, in how others treated me. When you stop folding yourself into corners, people have to decide whether they want to meet you in the open. Some people will, some won't. That is information, and it is not the worst thing in the world to have it clearly. I am 63 years old. I have a small scar below my left ear that I don't bother to cover anymore. I have a retirement account that is going to be enough. I have a friend who will sit in a hospital waiting room for 4 hours with bad coffee and a crossword puzzle. I have an October hike in a gorge in Ohio that I should have done 15 years ago. I have a son who is learning, slowly, imperfectly, the way people do when they're trying to become better than they've been. And I have this. The knowledge that I walked out of that ballroom with my dignity intact, in my good navy dress, without making a scene, without begging for recognition, without letting anyone in that room see me flinch. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply leave. Where are you watching from? And if you have ever given everything to someone only to feel like you disappeared in their eyes, I want you to know you are not alone. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. I've thought a lot about what really happened that night at the Harborview Inn. Not just what Theodore said into that microphone, but what had been building for years before he ever picked it up. Here's what I've come to understand. The things we allow quietly have a way of becoming permanent. Every time I wrote a check without a conversation, every time I swallowed the short phone call and told myself it was fine, every time I made myself smaller so Theodore could feel bigger in his new life, I was teaching him something, not on purpose, but I was teaching him nonetheless, that I would always be there, always absorb it, always ask for nothing in return, and he learned that lesson very well. That is not his fault entirely. That is the natural consequence of what I modeled. A child, even a grown one, will only understand the value of something when there is a cost to losing it. I had never let there be a cost. My love had no edges, and love without edges doesn't look like strength to the person receiving it. It looks like furniture. It looks like a given. It looks like a woman in a navy dress in the back of the room who helps keep the place tidy. The moment I walked out of that ballroom, something changed in the equation. Not because I planned some elaborate response, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I finally did the one thing I had avoided for years. I let the consequence exist. I stopped cushioning it. And here's what I noticed. When I stopped being endlessly available, Theodore had to sit with what he had done. There was no soft landing, no call the next morning where I reassured him it was okay. There was just the weight of his own choice, and him in it, without me smoothing it away. That weight is what eventually brought him to my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. Not my anger, not my demands, just the absence of the thing he had taken for granted. That is how real change works, I think. Not from lectures, not from ultimatums, from consequence allowed to land and stay. Marlene sat with me in a hospital waiting room for 4 hours the day of my surgery. She brought bad coffee and a crossword puzzle, and she didn't ask for anything in return. That is a different kind of love, the kind that doesn't erase itself to be present. I spent a long time giving Theodore the wrong model of what love looks like. Marlene had been showing me the right one for 20 years. If I could say one thing to anyone in the place I was in, and I mean the exact place, the 2 a.m. legal pad and the careful accounting and the chest that feels hollowed out, it would be this: your willingness to keep giving is not the same as your worthiness of being loved. You are not more valuable because you sacrifice more. You are not a better mother, a better person, a better anything, because you have nothing left for yourself. The most honest thing I ever did for my son was let him feel what his choices cost. That is not cruelty. That is respect. Treating him like a man capable of learning instead of a child I needed to protect from reality forever. I am 63 years old. I have a scar and a retirement account and a friend worth more than any of the things I gave away. And I have a son who is slowly, carefully becoming someone I recognize again. That is enough. That is more than enough.